Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. As my listeners know, since most of you are teachers, academics, and administrators, we really haven't bounced back when we look at COVID and attendance rates. And in fact, chronic attendance is still at about 25% nationwide in the United States. And there are many reasons for this, but one of those reasons is definitely motivation, student motivation, getting them to want to learn. Again, many reasons, but that's one of them. And so I'm really excited tonight to be joined by Mr. Alfie Kohn. Many of you might know that Alfie Kohn is known for his writing, his speaking, his research, in particular, his seminal book, Punished by Rewards, which really looks at the ways that we're trying to combat disengagement. Alfie's argument is basically when we give students the gold star, when we give grades and we give A's, that while we might be assisting motivation in the short term, extrinsically, in the long term, it's actually going to have the counter effect because people are going to be motivated by the reward, not necessarily by the long-term goal of learning. So I hope folks have either read that book or have been following Alfie, but I thought that this would be a great opportunity to talk to Alfie about his book and where we maybe still get some things wrong about his research, and also really talking about what motivation means today in the year 2025. So, Alfie, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So, Alfie, the first question I would like to ask is, again, you talk about the fact that we're actually doing ourselves a disservice when we focus on the extrinsic and we focus on external rewards. But when we talk about that, what do you think people, because I'm sure some people are already getting there, getting feathers in a dander, what would you say people still misunderstand most about your argument? And first of all, hopefully I summarized your argument effectively, but what do you think people still get wrong about it?
Well, the vast majority of people have never been introduced to this. Most of us believe that motivation is a single entity. It's a bunch of stuff you can have, and you can have a lot of it or you can have a little of it. It can go up, it can come down. We want students to have more of this stuff called motivation, so we dangle goodies in front of them so they'll be motivated. But what psychologists have been teaching us for more than half a century is that there are different kinds of motivation. And the kind matters more than the amount. You tossed around the word extrinsic, and in fact, that's one of the two types that psychologists speak of, most commonly, the other being intrinsic, which is not exactly the same thing as external and internal. So intrinsic motivation means that you are finding some fulfillment or value in a task for its own right. You're helping somebody else because you think that's the right thing to do, or you want to give that person pleasure or alleviate her pain, whatever. Intrinsic motivation means I'm reading this book because I like reading, or I like reading this topic, about this topic. Extrinsic motivation means that the motivation is something extrinsic to or outside of the task, such as you get a reward for doing it. So the first point to make is that intrinsic and extrinsic reasons for doing something are completely different. That's not that controversial once people are invited to fix their attention on this distinction. The second point is that intrinsic is far more powerful. No extrinsic goodie, no artificial inducement, grades, money, candy, whatever it is, can ever be as powerful as finding something valuable and exciting in its own right. But the punchline, the third point that I would want to make, and maybe this answers your question more directly about what people get wrong, is that intrinsic motivation isn't just different and it's not just better. Intrinsic motivation is undermined by the use of extrinsic inducements. Or to put it differently, the more you reward people for doing something, the more they tend to lose interest in whatever they had to do to get the reward. Hundreds of studies have found this across genders, across ages, across cultures, and across tasks. For example, and by the way, this includes tangible rewards, dessert, for example, symbolic rewards like grades, and verbal rewards like praise, good job, and so on. So what the research finds, for example, is that adults who are given a financial incentive to change their behavior about something, like, for example, to quit smoking or lose weight or go to the gym, end up at best right back where they started as soon as the reward is gone, but more often behind where they started, because the reward isn't just ineffective, it's actually counterproductive. Or children who are frequently rewarded or praised by their parents are less generous and likely to share than kids who were not treated like pets to begin with, by given the equivalent of a doggy biscuit for sharing their toys. And as far as I can tell, and I've been looking at this for a long time, every study about grades that has looked at the impact of grades as opposed to no grades has found that kids who have been led to focus on getting a good report card, getting an A on this paper or whatever, are now less interested in the topic, in the field, writing or science or whatever, and in learning itself, than people who were lucky enough to be in a school where there are no letter or number grades. It doesn't matter what the reward is, it doesn't matter the schedule on which it's given. The whole idea of creating extrinsic motivation by saying to kids, do this and you'll get that, tends to undermine excitement and interest in whatever they were doing, and ultimately to undermine excellence as well.
A lot there to unpack, Alfie. Why do you think that is, though? Why? Because it sounds on the surface that if we're giving students a reward, or adults really, but let's talk about students first if we can.
Sure.
We'll loop back to adults.
Mm-hmm.
Why, if we're giving students rewards to say, read a book, are they not going to say, hey, I like this book, let me read more of it?
Right.
So can you walk us through what's,
right. So step one of the argument is to explain why the quality of people's performance tends to decline. The research shows that if I took 100 people and I gave them all a puzzle to solve, and half of them were told, here, see if you can figure this out, and the other half were told, you're going to get a reward either for doing it or worse, as it turns out, for solving it successfully, that the people in the first group will tend to be more successful at solving the puzzle. So this is true of adults and kids. The quality of performance, particularly at challenging tasks that require, or those that require higher order thinking or creativity, tends to decline when people are doing it to get a reward. Now, there are a number of possible reasons why that's true. The one that I think we're going to focus on today with limited time, I deal with in my book other reasons that quality tends to decline in the face of rewards. But the main one is because interest tends to decline. So now you're asking, reasonably enough, yeah, so why does interest decline? And my reading of the research is that there are basically two reasons. The first is that rewards, exactly like punishments, are instruments of control. If I say to you, do this or I'm going to make you suffer, it's obvious I'm trying to control you. But if instead I say to you, do this and you'll get that, it's just sugar-coated control. I'm still trying to manipulate you. I'm just doing it in a different way. Rewards and punishments are not opposites. They're not two different strategies. They're both ways of doing things to people. And the only way you get good results in the long run is by working with people. So that's the first thing to realize, is that people don't like being controlled, including really short people. And on some level, if you're manipulating them by saying, jump through my hoops and here's what I'll give you for it, they might like the goodie itself. They might want the candy bar. They might want the dollar. They might want to be recognized and have somebody smile at them or hug them or give them a thumbs up. Approval by adults, very important. All of these things are desired. But what nobody wants is to have the things they desire used as a lever to control them. And so they end up becoming less excited about the whole deal because now it's all about control. That's the first explanation. The second explanation, in a way, is a lot simpler. It's that as soon as I say to you, do this and you'll get that, I have devalued this. If I say to a kid, read this book and here's the prize you'll get, what I'm teaching them is that reading isn't fun. It's something, they figure it must be something I wouldn't want to do, otherwise they wouldn't have to bribe me to do it. And so the mere act of offering a reward for something devalues whatever it is that you've tried to get them to do.
That makes total sense to me. And can you give us an example, Alfie, of a classroom where, because I'm sure you've been in many, where, and you've taught some yourself, where specifically do educators think that they're doing a good job in motivating kids or students, when in reality they're doing the exact opposite of what they should be doing? Could you give us an example of that?
Well, anytime a teacher uses a punishment but calls it a consequence, reframes it in his or her own mind, they may think that they're doing something that's more evolved, when in fact it's still punitive. And you can see that in the kids' faces. Calling it time out instead of forcibly isolating kids when they need us most may make the teacher feel better about punishing kids, but it's still a punishment. The same is true of, I gave you fair warning, so I'm doing it in a just way. Doesn't change anything. I'm still deliberately making kids suffer in the hope that this will make them change in the direction I want. That's another example. And of course, the big one is the big jump to rewards, where a lot of us were told, don't punish, reward. Catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. The point is, for the fly, they're still being caught. Catch kids doing something right and then give them positive reinforcement for it. A lot of people think they're on the right track. Not because they're bad teachers or bad people, but because no one has ever explained to them, you're still manipulating them, it's still disrespectful, and the research shows you're making it worse every time you do this. Because as soon as you frame it in the kid's mind is do this and you'll get that, the idea is, sure, you'll fade out the reward eventually and they'll see, by golly, reading is fun, as you indicated before. But that's terribly naive and contradicted by a pile of research that shows that every time you offer a reward for doing it, all you've bought is the behavior. In the long run, you're making it worse because now intrinsic motivation recedes even farther toward the horizon. And by the way, that may be one other aspect, one other way to answer your question about in real classrooms, how we think we're there, but we're really not. And that's the word behavior itself. So my Kohn's law, if I might be immodest and call it this, is the value of a resource for teachers, a workshop, a lecture, a book, an article, a blog, a podcast, whatever. The value of a resource for teacher is inversely related to the number of times the resource uses the word behavior. As soon as you talk about behavior, the stuff at the surface that you can see and possibly measure, you are missing what really counts. The values, the motives, the reasons for the behavior. In fact, when you talk about kids' behavior, you're missing the kids who engage in it. That's what behaviorism is all about, and why most of psychology, all but a few diehard Skinnerian radical orthodox people in large Midwestern state universities, why almost the entire field of psychology has moved past behaviorism. But in real schools, and by the way, families and workplaces, people are still consulting behavior analysts. They're still doing IEPs. They're still talking about kids' measurable behavioral responses and trying to reinforce this one or extinguish that one. So we have to move past the behavior to understand the kid, which is part of what happens when we move from a doing to approach, like rewards or punishments, to a working with approach that looks at the whole child.
I love how you more or less, Alfie, segued to my next question when we're talking about something that's done to children, and thinking more in terms of with the child, giving them student choice and voice.
Right.
And one thing you said, though, that I got to admit, I found a little jarring was this idea that praise is bad when you tell a kid, good job. I think back on all the number of times I've done that. So
Right.
I'm wondering, Alfie, is it different when you give praise about something that the child isn't doing themselves? So, for example, Johnny, I really love how you are citing your evidence. That's really going to give you a good idea on how to make an argument moving forward. So good for you. Is that a slight pivot? And maybe it is, maybe it isn't, that you feel teachers should make? And if that's not the right pivot, just in general, what do you recommend teachers and educators do? 2 or 3 things that they could do tomorrow to pivot to more of the environment that you're talking about?
So let's be clear. I'm not suggesting we remain sullenly silent with kids. I'm not suggesting we don't care about them. I'm not suggesting we don't offer warmth. I'm suggesting we offer unconditional acceptance, so they know that even when they screw up or fall short, that we still care about them and want the best for them. Praise is the opposite of unconditional support. By definition, praise is conditional acceptance. It says, when you do this, you get the good for me, the excitement, the thumbs up, whatever. So conditionality is the problem here. A verbal reward is still a reward. Say, good, I really like the way you ... is the problem. It doesn't matter so much what follows the ... Praising kids for their effort is really not that different from praising them for their ability. You know, despite the research that points out that focusing them on ability, as Carol Dweck talks about, is problematic in its own right. But the problem is praise, or more generally, extrinsic inducements themselves. So what can teachers do? First of all, sometimes you can just shut up and watch and listen. Most of the time we praise kids, we're doing it for us because we feel weird if we're not saying it. And whenever that's true, boy, is it time to rethink what we're doing. Sometimes we can just be there for them. Sometimes, though, we want to describe what it is we see. I notice you're using, for your case here, the way we're talking about it. That's very different from, I like the way you're using evidence. Good job doing that. Because now I'm pulling them out of what they've done. And the point is not about evidence or whatever it is the kid's doing, taking turns in the younger grades, etc. The point is to get the teacher's approval. And whenever that becomes the point, the reward, it undermines the value of and the kid's interest in and commitment to whatever we gave them our approval for doing. The other thing we could do, starting tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, maybe we do this in steps, incrementally, we start by just describing what we see, which we can do, by the way, in writing, in narrative, responses to what kids have done. We can simply describe and take out the judgment language. That's the most important thing to realize. Praise is not about encouragement. It's about judgment. That's not what kids need to become sharper thinkers or better people. So the third thing we could do really is to ask them questions. How did you figure out which sources would be useful to cite? Why I noticed, I used to say this to when my daughter was very young, she loved drawing. And I would say, I'm noticing you're putting toes on those animals. You weren't doing that last month. How did you figure out how to draw toes? And I honestly wanted to know. A question like that, to which I do not already know the answer, it's not a false question. How many times have I told you? But that pulls her into the drawing and gets her to reflect on how she did it, saying, oh, I love the way you use so many details in your drawing, pulls her out of the drawing, makes drawing a means to the end of getting the patronizing pat on the head. So sometimes be quiet, sometimes describe, sometimes ask questions. But it's not just a matter of changing the script. Oh, I'm not supposed to use that word. I should use those words. No, pull back the camera. Look at the big picture here. It's about something much bigger than just which words that aren't exactly praise. It's about moving from doing to working with, moving from telling to asking, moving from focusing on how to get kids to comply with our expectations to thinking in broader terms about what the kids want. The best teachers do a lot less telling and a lot more asking. And not just asking this individual kid, how do you figure this out? Class meetings where the teacher is engaging the whole class in a more democratic style of figuring out how do we want our classroom to be.
And what's really resonating with me, Alfie, and what you're talking about, it's we've been talking largely so far about things that teachers could do.
Right.
More times than not, it's to students as opposed to with students. But we are progressing now in our conversation, thinking about when we talk about things that we do with students, we're really, if I'm understanding that correctly, talking about student agency and autonomy. Am I right in suggesting that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. For so many reasons. Kids get a lot more excited about the learning in that case, assuming there's valuable learning to be done and not just facts to be memorized for a test, which is a whole different discussion we could have. But look, kids learn how to make good decisions by making decisions, not by following directions. And sadly, a lot of classrooms are really just about following direction.
Indeed. So now, just switching gears very quickly, because we've been dancing around it, talking about, again, what teachers can be doing with students. One of the reasons that I wanted to reach out to you, Alfie, just to give you a little background is, of course, I followed your research and have known it as an educator, but I'm part of this branding, marketing, business development group run by JT O'Donnell, who runs Work It Daily. And she was talking to us about your research, primarily using it with adults and talking about how in the working world, oftentimes we're still in this reward culture that we reward workers through bonuses, through promotions. But the reality is, and we could look at the data on how many people are really satisfied in their jobs, there again, there's a low satisfaction rate. So again, just pulling out of education for a moment and talking about JT's world, where do you think, is that an accurate assumption of what we are doing in the working world? And
Yeah, absolutely.
thoughts about that?
I mean, the average American corporation is like a giant Skinner box with a parking lot. I've written a lot of books just about teaching and just for teachers. I've written a couple for parents. But Punished by Rewards, the one back here, has 2 chapters each about teaching, parenting, and managing. And I dug deep into the research on what happens in workplaces. And all of the research that I've been describing and all the theory about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, doing to and working with, et cetera, all plays out in almost exactly the same way in workplaces. It's just that the rewards are a little different. But the effect is exactly the same. As far as I can tell, no controlled scientific study has ever found a long-term enhancement in the quality of work people do in the workplace as a result of any kind of pay-for-performance scheme, incentive plan, bonus, anything like that. Look, one thing I've learned in all of this time, I've been working on this for many, many years, is that rewards are fundamentally about power.
Mm.
They're about people with more power trying to control the actions of people with less power. Parents with children, teachers with students, sometimes administrators with teachers, and generally in the workplace, executives with their employees. That's why the control always runs in that direction, and it feels weird to praise your boss, right? So it's merit pay for teachers is just as destructive as behavior management, behavior charts for children. It's the same basic idea. And the weird thing is that on some level, if we've ever, as adults, known what this is like and how fundamentally insulting and manipulative it is to have these top-down mandates, sometimes where we're offered recognition or more money or something like that for following these mandates or raising scores on really bad standardized tests. As the test scores go up, the learning tends to go down. But again, that's a whole different conversation. But we know what it feels like to be manipulated by people with more power. So the fundamental question a teacher needs to ask is, am I going to treat my kids in the insulting way that I'm being treated? Or am I going to treat my kids the way I wish I was being treated? That's the fork in the road. And so our job is to say, yeah, to this stuff from above, and to figure out how there's going to be more democratic, responsive, responsible, respectful interaction to do stuff together in the classroom, and hope that someday maybe the people who have more power than I do learn that's the way you treat adults too.
And again, Alfie, you must have read my playbook because you're segueing me beautifully to the next question. And you mentioned teachers feeling insulted and not doing unto their students what's being done unto them. So how should administrators think about professional development of teachers? And how do we, as an education system, motivate the adults in our system who are indeed the teachers?
You can't motivate somebody else. You can make
Right.
somebody with less power than you do something. That's what rewards and punishments are all about, whatever euphemisms we give to them instead. But I can't make you want to do it. And the more I reward you for it, the less you're going to find it valuable, for its own sake, in its own right. What I can do is work with you to try to create a culture, a climate, in the case of teachers with students, a curriculum, where people's natural desire to figure stuff out, and in the case of adults, do work they can be proud of, are allowed to blossom, and to figure out the best way to do that with you, if I'm an administrator with my teachers, is to ask them, how can I help? That's what administrators should be asking a lot. What are our long-term goals for the students? Let's do a workshop where I elicit that, which is, by the way, what I do when I do workshops. I start out by asking, what are your long-term goals for your kids? And I get the same answers everywhere I go. And then what I do for a living is I say to people, you say you want this, so how come you're doing that? Because here's the research showing that makes it less likely you're going to get your own goals. So that's what I would do. I would figure out how to help create a culture and a climate where we can meet these goals together rather than unilaterally deciding what the outcomes should be and then figuring out how to force or manipulate you into doing what I want.
Indeed, indeed. So now, Alfie, when people do criticize your philosophy, what do you think is the most valid criticism, and how would you address that?
That it's hard to do if you've been doing it a different way for many, many years. That you can't just flip a switch and suddenly become a working with teacher. That if I start doing class meetings, I may not be prepared for what happens when one kid seems to hijack the meeting, or when kids who themselves are so used to being treated like pets that you take away the extrinsic inducements and some of the kids act out. So anybody who thinks after listening to half an hour or reading an article or going to an in-service session, they're all ready to make a radical change, and then it backfires, they say, well, that's unrealistic. In fact, what I'm saying is not unrealistic. The unrealistic part is not in the ability to get there eventually. It's that it takes time and support and hopefully some good coaching and being willing to hit a dead end and then back up and figure out how to do it better, hopefully not having to do that by yourself. So if people say it's tough, if I've been told to just praise kids all the time or use time out, or now I do standards-based grading and think I've solved anything. No, any kind of grading is undermining interest in learning. And by the way, the quality of learning. We have to make these radical changes, but we're not going to get there by next Tuesday.
And I wasn't thinking of asking this, but you reminded me. So what is the alternative to grading?
Well, it's a long question, and I think we're coming to the end of our time here. I write about this in great detail, including in a number of articles, as well as books, but very briefly. Assessment is about gathering information about what kids are doing and how they're doing and where they may need some help. And then sharing what I've learned about that with the kids and their parents. That's it. It's gathering and sharing. You never need a test to gather that information. That's a whole different topic. And you never need a grade to share it. So there's a good way and a great way to replace grades. The good way is with narrative reports, qualitative descriptions that do not reduce kids or anything they do to a number or a letter, where you simply give a qualitative account of what's going on. The great way is a conversation, having a conference with kids and with parents, with kids and parents where the kids are running the show. Mm-hmm. Reason that a conference is better is because a narrative is still a monologue, whereas a conversation, there's at least the theoretical possibility of a dialogue here. So we are sharing qualitative feedback. By the way, if it's a judgment, it's not feedback. Feedback means information. If I say good job or give you 100, that's not feedback, that's judgment. And in the case of a grade, it's even worse than that. So there's a lot of people have done a lot of work on authentic forms of assessment for gathering information, what it means to keep portfolios, to do performance-based assessment where kids show you what they can do with what they know. Huge topic, shelves full of books on this. And there's also a book that came out a few years ago, especially for high school and college teachers, that I wrote the foreword to, many different contributors, called Ungrading, about the teachers who've realized it's not about grading a little differently or a little better. You've got to stop grading entirely to have any chance of moving toward reclaiming and sustaining the intrinsic motivation. Getting rid of grades is necessary, but not sufficient.
Indeed. And in fact, you remind me that it's on my list to do an episode on portfolio assessment. So you've really encouraged me to do that. Alfie, one last question before we talk about where people can find you in your books and your information and your writing. Alfie, where can people find out more information about you and the work you do?
Well, thanks for asking. My website is the answer. Alfie Kohn, if you spell it, you're there, Kohn, alfiekohn.org. That has descriptions of all my books. It has hundreds of articles that are freely available, as well as blog posts. And it has something I just started a few months ago, which is a podcast of my own, which is called Kohn's Zone, which you can get on the usual podcast places, but get most efficiently and with most background information on the same website where the books and articles are arranged.
And what I will do, Alfie, is I will put those links onto the show notes so people can find that information. Alfie, thank you so much for your time today. This has been very informative, and I hope folks take you up on your offer to not do things to students, but with students and with our teachers. So again, Alfie, thank you for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for your interest.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.